Hey, Dave, I want to talk about that one word I think that Paul uses to describe ministers or describe really what you might think of as Christians, whether you're in any sort of what we may call leadership or not. This is a term that he uses on one occasion. Luke also uses it, but I think it's very descriptive and it's very telling of what Paul thought of himself and the position he was in. And Luke as well, when Luke uses it in the first couple verses of the letter that's named after him. But a lot of times we see preachers, they, whoever, want to refer to themselves as shepherds, and a lot of times, and that's fine. But Jesus uses that analogy, although we are definitely under shepherds if you're a pastor. But when you just look into the word about leadership, there's really nothing there. Very little. Every time now and then you will see that word that's used for overseers, which it's not. Let me just say this: it's not an office necessarily. It's more of a gifting, and there is a difference. For instance, when you see, and I think it's 1 Timothy when it says, "If any man desire the office of a bishop," the word office is not in the original. It's bishop, and so it's really, in my opinion, it's more of it's a gifting. In other words, we all work together. There's not one person that's really set that's any better than anybody else. And Paul will use this analogy, although he's also credited with saying more about the leadership structure than anybody else. I just want you to see how Paul looks at this, and I think that he really even looked at himself as just someone who was almost on the bottom, so to speak. And we'll say that with this word. I'm trying to hang on, but I want you to hang on with me until we get there. But we'll go through 1 Corinthians just kind of briefly, and I want you to see the context of where he's going here in chapter 4 when he uses this word. Some of you that are listening to this may already know where I'm going with this. Now, the word a lot of times we see, even for Jesus, you'll see in the book of Romans, it says, and Jesus was a minister. I think it says of the circumcision. Now, the word minister there is the same word where we get our word deacon. I've heard people argue different things about, like, well, Phoebe was a deacon because this term was used of her. Well, it was also used of Jesus Christ. So Jesus was a deacon. In other words, he was a servant. Kind of goes back to the fact of in Philippians when it says, and he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even to death on the cross. It says he became a servant. In other words, as Mark said, he came not to be served, but to serve, to be a minister. It was what Jesus came to do. It was the example that he wanted to set the most. In John chapter 13, when he washed the disciples' feet, and Peter said, well, you'll never wash my feet. He said, well, if I don't, you'll have no part with me. And so Philip said, okay, not only my feet, but my hands, my head, just wash everything. Because Peter started to understand how important this was about serving. And this is the precedent that Jesus set, and I think Paul kind of talks about that here in 1 Corinthians, and kind of be a little bit of paraphrasing as I go through this, but Paul's writing this book of 1 Corinthians, and he says, I've heard from the house of Chloe that there's problems among you. So that's kind of, in verse 11, this is what it says, and this is ESV, and I'll paraphrase a little bit. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people, the house of Chloe's, how the King James puts it, that there's quarreling among you. What I mean, that each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. And then he says, is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? So what he's saying here, now understand, this is the beginning of the letter. He says, the house of Chloe's let me know that there's some problems. Now, through the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul's going to address several problems. We'll just touch that briefly, see the context of what Paul's talked about. But the main thing he starts with is this. Some of you said you follow Paul, some Apollos, some Cephas, some Christ. So what Paul is trying to say is that these people that have been teaching Paul, Peter, or Cephas as he's called here, Apollos, that's not who you're supposed to be following. So some of you say you're following Christ, but he's making the point that it is Christ that we are to follow, and not Paul, not Cephas, not Apollos. And so this is something we have to be careful of. And when you're, honestly, if you're the one speaking, myself included. It's very easy to fall into this, to see how many people are there, how many people have said something, how many people really got something out of it. But it's not about that at all. God is using people to teach. He's putting people in different positions because of their gifting. That doesn't mean they're any more important than anyone else in the body of Christ. And Paul is going to address that in this letter as he goes through this. He says, I thank God I baptized none of you but Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that I was baptized by the name of Paul. I did baptize also the household of Stephanus. Beyond that, I don't know if I baptized anybody else. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect. I think I'm quoting King James there. So Paul is saying, I'm just preaching the gospel. And it's not about me, whether I baptize, and say, well, Paul baptized me. And it's like as if people were saying, well, I was baptized with Paul, and there was others saying, I was baptized with Apollos. And in some places, when you read through even Acts, you get the feeling that Apollos was kind of following Paul at one point and honestly trying to cause divisions by what he taught, until Priscilla and Aquila got him aside and said, we want to show you the way of God more perfectly. And they taught him the whole counsel of God. And so you can see different little aspects and characteristics in these people like that. But Paul is saying none of us are any better than any other. And so he's making a whole point that it's all about Christ Jesus and him that is crucified. Now I'm thinking as I'm kind of scrolling through here, 1 Corinthians, going to stay in that the whole time. It says, chapter 3, let's just start chapter 3. He starts talking about divisions of the church. He said, brothers, I could not address you as spiritual. But he said, but as people of the flesh and infants of Christ, I fed you not with milk, but with meat. So he's telling him literally. Now, if you read through 1 Corinthians, you're going to see some things that are like, my goodness, man, he's really harsh in some areas here. But he's telling them, I'm only feeding you with milk. And this is Paul. He gets into chapter 3. He says, for while there is jealousy and strife among you, this is why the household of Chloe wrote Paul. And then Paul is writing back about the strife, the problems that's there. A lot of the strife is what he's talked about there in chapter 1, that some of you talk about how you were born of Apollos, some of Paul, some of Cephas. So Paul's addressing that. While there's jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? For when one says, no, he's following the same thing he kind of said earlier, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not being merely human? What then is Apollos? What is Paul? And then he says, servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. So he's saying we're all servants. We all fall under this same thought process, this same. In other words, they're all one body, and Paul will actually bring that up in a little bit. Now, this when he says servants here, it's ministers in the KJV, and it's the same word where we get the word deacon, as I was talking about earlier. That's not the word I'm going to talk about here in a moment. But he uses the word deacon or as servant several times. Now, if you'll remember when God first called the deacons in Acts chapter 6, 7, when they actually set them aside, they were set aside because the widows of the Grecians didn't have anyone to help them at the table. So they were literally picked to serve, to wait on the widows, whether it was what we may picture in a restaurant going around with a plate to serve them. I think it was probably a little different than that. But that is the thought process that goes into the deacons in their office, as we would call them, and in the book of Acts, chapter 6 and 7. That's the word he uses here, servants, through whom you believe, signed to each other. And then he says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase, or the growth, as he says in ESV. So then neither is he who plants nor he who waters anything, but God who gives the increase. Paul continuing down that thought. It's not about me. It's not about Apollos. It's not about Peter. but it's God who gives the increase. God has given different giftings to different people. You may not be a teacher, you may not be a preacher, but God has given you a gift if you are part of the body of Christ. Paul will address that a little bit deeper here in a moment. For we are God's fellow workers, you are God's field, God's building. He says we're fellow workers. In other words, we work together. That is the whole point. So let no one boast in men. Now this is verse 21, chapter 3. For all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours, and you are Christ's, and Christ is God's. So you can see the same thought process through the first few chapters of what he's trying to say. And then I'm getting to chapter 4 where I'm going to talk about what the main point of all this. And then we'll just see some other things he addresses. But in chapter 4, this is what he says. This is how one should regard us. And this is how the King James puts it, if you're more familiar with that. Let a man account of us as of the ministers of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Now, account, it's basically like Old English, and it's kind of how we got our word accountant, and the word count is in it. So you have to understand that you're adding up. In other words, you're trying to decide by, the evidence. Let a man look, let a man decide, let a man examine, figure it out. Whether you have to write down on paper, well, this is what they did. It's like a mathematical term almost. And the ESV says this is how one should regard us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God. Now this is the word. Now the King James says ministers, as of the ministers of Christ. So this is Paul. He's referring to himself. He's obviously referring to Apollos and Peter, or Cephas as he's called here. These are pretty well-known people in the New Testament church. He said, let a man decide of us, account of us, as of the ministers of Christ. So he's referring to him and these other people, men that he's already mentioned, as the ministers of Christ. And he's saying this is what we are. And I think he's basically, we could say that all Christians kind of fall under this. No matter what your position is in a church or whatever, the ministry, as ministers. This word, I don't like to tell a lot of the Greek because I'm sure I mispronounce it, but it's hyperetes. First part of that is kind of hype. Now, I'm in the medical field. If you use a hypodermic needle, it's something that goes under hypo, the dermic. So you're giving an injection, a hypodermic needle. So it's under the dermis. This is hyperetes. So it's under. Retes is rower. So he refers to the ministers as an under rower. Now, some of you may already have a picture of what this means in your mind, but during this time when Paul was writing, a lot of people would understand because the Roman ships, they had to be rowed by someone. So underneath, they would have people that were rowing. They were the under rowers. They were the people that were down there and they had to work. I've read different things about this. Some would say there was like 4 to an oar. Be so many oars. I don't remember exactly how many, depending on the size of the ship. Some people would say that these were like not necessarily slaves, but bond servants, and others would say that these were actually like prisoners. It probably would depend on the situation. And I'm sure definitely that there were times when they were prisoners. Even the French a few hundred years ago used galley slaves, which is what this would be, under rowers, in order to get them from one place to another. It was people that were already in prison, so said, here, this is what we're going to make you do. And so they were almost, in some thought, considered the lowest of the low. Now, he's not saying, understand, he's not saying, let a man figure us as of the leadership of the church, to look to us, to make sure that we get what's coming to us, because we're in charge. It's almost the opposite of what Paul is saying here. He said, let a man account of us as as the under rowers. Now, just think about what he's saying. This is Paul and Peter and Apollos. He said, we're just the under rowers. Now, just think of what they were doing. Of course, I think they would kind of be more on one side, and then there was a group on the other side. They were the servants that would row the boat to get everybody where they were going. Now, just quickly, and this is some thoughts, I kind of gathered this from some other people, and different thoughts as I was just thinking about this. But when they were rowed, they all had to row to the same beat, and it would be to the beat of the captain. My understanding is a lot of times they would have this kind of an alleyway where they could see up, where they were down below and they would row, and they could see up. They could see the captain, where the captain would sit in the front. They could all see it. They all had to march to that beat, or not march, but row to that beat, the beat of the captain. Now, obviously, here's Paul and Peter, who we would consider leaders in the early church. So they're not referring to themselves as the captain. They're referring to Jesus Christ as the captain. That is the beat to who they would all row, to who they was all supposed to row. And so they all had to row together. They had to go in unison. So that's the kind of the second point. They would have to row together. You can't have one person going at one time and one at another, because you would just be ended up going in circles. So they had to go to the same beat. And think about it. Honestly, if one person is getting completely tired, you might just kind of go through the motions, and the rest of them are having to carry you. So there's times when obviously you might do that, but they would all have to work together in order to do that. They would all have to go at the same time, and one may work a little harder while the other one's just absolutely completely wore out. This is the picture that Paul's making of what we would call leadership in the church, or of the church in general, of the Christians and believers in general. Listen, we are under rowers. We're just servants. We all work together. We're supposed to work together. And consider this. Someone who's an under rower, they were not seen. People a lot of times did not even know their name. They would not even know that they were down there, except for the fact that logically they knew someone had to be rowing the boat. They were without honor, so to speak. Paul is saying we are just under rowers. Now, Luke uses the same term in his book. In chapter 1, he talks about it as ministers of Christ. He's referring to himself, Luke is, as an under rower, a servant, one who's on the bottom deck, where getting no honor, just running in unison with everyone else to the beat of Jesus Christ. What a word. What a great word, a term to describe people who are in leadership positions in the church. And almost, I say that reluctantly, although we're just so used to that kind of language about leadership. But you do have to have structure in the church, absolutely. But there are so many that are in that structure toward the top that have misused that have completely taken Christ out of it, where they want acclamation or accolades or however you want to put it, where they want to be the one that everyone else is looking to. And Paul said, and as much as Paul led the way in a lot of ways as we see, but he said, we're just under rowers working together. And I don't think Paul would ever let that get in his way. If you'll remember there, and literally in this book. Now there's more Paul says here what we could look into. It says, and stewards of the mystery of God, and and he talks a little bit about that. 6 says, I have applied all these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit, brothers, that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up in favor of one against another. So see, he's still talking about how he started this. Don't look at me, don't look at Apollos or anyone as better than the other. And this is the whole point that Paul has been trying to make here, as he refers to them as under rowers. We're all in this together. We're not supposed to be doing this for any, to be put on a pedestal or anything like that. And I personally see so many pastors, I really feel like are that way. Now, I know a lot that aren't. And there are a lot of good humble people out there that are trying to help with the Church of Christ. I believe that 100%. But we need to be careful as Christians to understand that we are under rowers. Now, Paul, he's writing through, I'm just going to quickly go through to get to the next point that goes along with this quickly. So he talks in chapter 5, 6, and 7 basically about sexual immorality, about problems with marriage. So obviously that is a part of the problem that was at the church in Corinth. So it was about leadership, about how they looked at one person better than another instead of looking at Jesus Christ. Then they had these problems amongst the church about whether it was a lawsuit, because that kind of goes in that a little bit in chapter 6, but also the sexual immorality and all those things that were going on. The unmarried, the widows, food offered to idols in chapter 8. So what they were eating, there were a lot that still felt like they should be under the Jewish dietary law. Paul tries to tell them, no, it's not about that. It's about Jesus Christ. It was all centered on that. And then as he gets into chapter 9, he even talks about, do I say these, chapter 9, verse 8, do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox which treads out the grain. It is the oxen that God is concerned. So in other words, and I've heard this verse used so many times about pastors should get paid, and I'm not in any way against that, but notice that Paul will not take any. He says, did he certainly speak for sake? Is it written? He says, verse 11, if we have sown spiritual things among you, we reap material things from you. Now, this is what Paul's saying. It says, so someone who's just doing this, they actually should reap in some ways from the people that they're ministering to. So it's not wrong in any sense, unless it gets to that point where it becomes wrong. In other words, when it's taking away from everything else, when there's so much of the church that's suffering, or people in the church that's suffering, because they have to meet this bill of paying this person. Now, Butch Ikes, who wrote that book on the country church, had the opportunity to meet a few years ago. I like how they had the monetary, the financial things of their church. It was basically set up on a percentage. This percentage would go to salaries in the church. So in other words, if the offerings went down, the salaries went down with it, because it was a percentage, and that's how it was set up. And he also said this that I really liked. And he said, I would rather see more bivocational people in the church than one or two full-time paid staff. And he was referring to himself as well. And so you say, well, is that wrong because of what Paul says? No, listen to what Paul says. Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. This is verse 12. But we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel. So what he's saying, he says, we have not done this. And he says in verse 15, but I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe upon me if I preach not the gospel. If I do this in my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I have entrusted with stewardship. What is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. Now, say what you want. Paul is saying here, I did not take anything. Now, obviously, when Paul went from town to town, he would stay at people's houses. No doubt they would feed him. But it sounds as if Paul was not taking a salary. In fact, in one place in the book of Acts, it talks about he dwelt with Priscilla and Aquila because they were of the same craft. They were tent makers. So Paul was obviously a tent maker. He obviously worked. At least a lot of places he went, he would work while he was there. And Paul says that. Now, he's giving right for people to take and be supported by the people in the church, but he's also saying, I didn't do it. So it's as if you have a little bit of Bible for each standing there in this sense. Now, remember, Paul and then he talks about idolatry. Now, I'm trying to just stick with then head coverings, the Lord's Supper. Then he gets to chapter 12. Now, I just want to put this in perspective. We've all heard this analogy that Paul's used if you've been in church. So he says, now, concerning spiritual gifts. I don't want you to be ignorant, as the King James puts it, but you know that when you were pagans, you were led astray. And he says, there are varieties of gifts, but the same spirits, varieties of service, but the same Lord, and varieties of activities, but the same God who empowers them all. So he's saying we have different gifts, abilities, activities, administrations, but God, it's all the same God. So then he gets into this. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the one body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For it is one Spirit, we were all baptized into one body. Verse 14, for the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I am not of the hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less part of the body. If the ear should say, because I am not of the eye, I do not belong to the body, that should not make it any less part of the body. It even goes on to say that even these smaller things were more needful. So Paul's whole point, now I understand there are things thrown in the middle of it, so it's not all about this one point, but a big part of what Paul is trying to say as he gets back into it in chapter 12, he said, Chloe's house told me that this church in Corinth, the church that I helped start, they're having problems. And a lot of you were thinking one person's, there were probably even people in that church that were trying to say, oh, I'm doing this, let me. Apparently, that's why Paul's addressing it and addressing it so hard. He said, none of us are better, we're just under rowers. Now consider how deflated these people were that were in the church that were trying to make themselves of better or more reputation than other people in the church. As he said, listen, you're just an under rower, just like me and Apollos and Peter. Says we're all under Christ. And then he goes into this analogy about we're all one body. Christ is the head, as he says earlier in the chapter before, and none of us are. So he says it doesn't matter what your gifting is. All have this giftings that are different, as he starts out chapter 12 with. But he says it doesn't matter what that is. We all serve the same body. So no matter what your gifting is, no matter what my gifting is, we're all supposed to be serving the same purpose, the same body. We are the body of Christ. No longer do we sacrifice in a temple, but our body is the temple. And so we are to make the sacrifice, whatever that is that we're doing, and doing it. And as Paul says in Romans, this is a reasonable service that we would do these things. So Paul expects us and tells us and says that he is an under rower and that he is just part of this body. Nobody's better than anybody else. We're all to be serving together. And if we could do that, and if we could be under rowers, not worried about what we're doing. Now I understand, I have desires in my heart about what to do. So I think that is the gifting, the desire to do something. The desire to teach, or the desire to go somewhere and help somebody build a house, if that's what it is, or the desire to give, the desire, that is the gifting, and God puts that within people so that we may do those things that we really love to do, and God can use all of it to come together, but nobody's any better than anybody else. We are simply under rowers. And I think there's no better term to describe what Christians are, Christians in leadership, Christians in different positions, than an under rower. So until next time,